One of our members, Russell Acord, was able to capture something on his thermal scope, which has a 500-yard distance, and in it he sees something walking on two legs. It's not a bear, it's not a human, and so it leaves one to wonder what it could be. And we have that video analyzed by experts.
Bryce Johnson tracked something deep into the Alaskan wilderness, and what he found changed everything. 20 workers had been reporting strange events for days. Tools moved overnight, missing items reappearing neatly placed at the forest edge. No footprints, no explanations, just a growing feeling that something was watching their every move and that they were in the wrong place. Could this finally be proof that Bigfoot is real and far more intelligent than anyone imagined? Or did something even stranger lurk between those trees? Join us as we follow the trail that pushed Bryce Johnson and his crew to their absolute limit. The expedition that followed the clues. It did not begin in Alaska. It began with a discovery in California that quietly set everything in motion. A research team had been tracking something unusual in the region and had identified a rare wolf species whose movement trail was pointing north, deep into some of the most remote wilderness on the continent. And for Bryce and his team, that single clue was enough to change the entire direction of their investigation. The trail led them to Prince of Wales Island, a vast and densely forested part of Alaska that sits separated from the rest of the world by water, mountains, and miles of trees so old and so thick that the light barely reaches the ground beneath them, a place where the silence has weight to it and the forest feels like it is watching you, even before anything has happened to justify that feeling. For most people, it would be an uncomfortable place to spend a single night. But for Bryce and his partner Maria, it was exactly where the evidence was pointing and exactly where they needed to be. Before the investigation could begin properly, they started talking to the people who actually lived there. And what those conversations produced was not the mild local folklore that researchers sometimes encounter in places with unusual reputations. It was something rawer and more serious than that. Accounts from real people carrying real fear that had clearly been sitting with them for a long time before anyone from outside had thought to ask about it. The locals described screams coming from deep inside the forest at hours when no person should have been out there. Unexplained disappearances of people who had walked into the tree line and simply never come back. And a small number of accounts that described something far more disturbing. Moments where a person had been taken, removed from a location without explanation and without trace. Maria worked through the interviews steadily while Bryce mapped the surrounding terrain, and together they began building a picture that was considerably darker than either of them had expected when they first boarded the flight north. This island was not simply a location with an interesting reputation. It was a place where something had been happening for a very long time, and the people who lived there had learned to build their lives carefully around it. But nothing the locals had said so far had fully prepared the team for what the community itself looked like up close, because an entire town was living in a fear so deep it had already pushed some families to walk away from everything. A town living in fear. When a community goes quiet around a subject, that silence is its own kind of evidence. And on Prince of Wales Island, the silence was everywhere, sitting inside conversations that stopped just short of the important details in the careful way people chose their words, in the looks exchanged between residents when certain questions were asked. And Bryce and Maria had been in the field long enough to recognize what that kind of collective guardedness actually meant. Community meetings had been held in the period before the team arrived, gatherings where frightened residents had come together trying to make sense of what was happening around them and work out what could reasonably be done about it. And those meetings had not produced comfort or solutions. They had produced the slow and difficult realization that nobody in any position of authority had a meaningful answer to offer, and that whatever was happening in the forest was not responding to any of the ordinary ways that communities try to manage a problem. For some families, that realization had been the final push, and they had packed what they could carry and left. walking away from homes and land that had belonged to their families across multiple generations. These were not panic decisions made in a single frightened night. They were the result of a long and steady accumulation of experiences that had worn the will to remain completely down to nothing. More than 20 people had direct experiences they were willing to describe in private, but refused to discuss anywhere that could be recorded or repeated publicly. And that refusal was not cowardice. It was the considered decision of ordinary working people who had nothing to gain from telling their stories, and a clear sense of what they stood to lose if the wrong kind of attention followed. Then, one person agreed to talk, a logger who would only appear on camera wearing a mask, his face and identity kept completely hidden, and while the condition was unusual, the team accepted it immediately because they understood that this man's willingness to speak at all was already more than almost anyone else had offered. He had seen something out there, and the first thing he made clear was that whatever lived in those mountains had been there far longer than any of the current residents had, and it had no intention of leaving. That's their territory. The masked logger did not speak like someone trying to impress anyone. He spoke like someone who had spent a long time trying to make peace with something he could not explain and had quietly failed. His voice was steady, but his words carried the particular weight of a person who has genuinely been changed by an experience. And from the first moment he began describing the logging site, it became clear that this was not a story built on rumor or imagination. The site itself was unlike most working locations of its kind, sitting approximately 30 miles from the nearest town, with no proper road connecting it to the outside world, accessible only by difficult terrain that made any kind of rapid response or outside assistance essentially impossible. The crew that worked there operated in near total isolation, living and working in a pocket of wilderness that the modern world had not reached in any meaningful way, surrounded on all sides by forests so dense and so deep that visibility beyond the immediate clearing was almost nothing. It was in this environment that the disturbances began, and the logger described them with the kind of reluctant precision that comes from having replayed the events many times in private. He was not dramatic about it, he simply laid out what had happened in sequence, and the sequence was deeply unsettling. The crew had begun noticing that the area carried a reputation long before any of them personally experienced anything strange, because the older locals, the men and women who had lived in the surrounding region for decades, had always been clear about one thing. Those mountains were not somewhere you went, not because of any legal boundary or official restriction, but because of an understanding that had been passed down quietly through the community for as long as anyone could remember. The creatures that lived up there, whatever they were, had claimed that ground, and the arrangement that kept people safe was a simple one. You stayed out of their territory and they stayed out of yours. The loggers said it plainly. They never went up there, and everyone who worked the land long enough eventually understood why, because the ones who had ignored that understanding over the years had not always come back, and the ones who did come back were not always the same afterwards. Bryce and Maria listened carefully, and as the interview concluded, both of them were already thinking about the same question. Because knowing the territory existed was one thing, but knowing what actually lived inside it was something else entirely. And the answers were about to get much harder to sit with. The first signs. Something is watching. The logging crew had been working that site long enough to know its rhythms, the sounds it made at different hours, the way the tree line looked at dusk, the particular quiet that settled over the clearing after dark. And that familiarity was exactly what made the first disturbances so difficult to dismiss. When something feels wrong in a place you know well, you cannot talk yourself out of it the way you might in an unfamiliar location. And for these workers, something had begun to feel very wrong indeed. It started with the tools, small things at first, items left in one position found in another the following morning. Equipment moved from where it had been deliberately placed the night before, arranged or repositioned in ways that suggested intention rather than accident. The crew checked for the obvious explanations immediately, because practical men working in the wilderness do not jump to extraordinary conclusions. They look for bears, for weather damage, for the kind of mundane interference that remote locations occasionally produce. None of those explanations held, because there was no physical evidence of any large animal having entered the site. No tracks, no disturbed ground, no broken fencing or torn material of any kind. Whatever was moving through that clearing was doing so without leaving a trace. And that detail alone was enough to shift the atmosphere among the workers in a way that was difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. A bear you can prepare for, a storm you can wait out, but something that moves without evidence and rearranges your world while you sleep belongs to a different category of problem entirely. And the crew felt that distinction settle over the camp like a change in weather. Then the sounds began, and the sounds were worse than the silence had been. They came at night, rising from somewhere deep in the tree line, and the best description any witness could offer was that they resembled a woman in serious distress, a raw and urgent sound that carried through the dark with enough force to pull people out of sleep and hold them completely still. Alongside that came other vocalizations that suggested an animal in pain or panic, sounds that did not match any species the workers could identify from their years of experience in that landscape. Each night, the sounds moved closer to the camp, and each night they grew louder, as though whatever was producing them was testing boundaries, measuring responses, learning the shape of the crew's fear with the kind of patient methodology that does not belong to any ordinary predator. The crew had stopped debating what it might be, and had started simply trying to get through each night. But the nights were about to get considerably harder to survive. When fear takes over. There is a particular kind of fear that does not announce itself loudly. It creeps in slowly through the accumulation of small things, each one explainable on its own, but impossible to dismiss when added together. And by the time the logging crew reached this stage of their experience, that fear had moved well past the creeping stage and settled into something far more constant and consuming. These were not easily frightened people. They were experienced outdoor workers who spent their professional lives in conditions that most people would find genuinely intimidating. And yet, the atmosphere inside that camp had shifted into something none of them had encountered before. The feeling of being watched had become so persistent and so specific that the crew had developed a shared language for it without ever formally discussing it. Small glances exchanged across the clearing, the instinctive way people began moving in groups rather than alone. They were not panicking, but they were operating under a continuous low-level vigilance that was exhausting in a way that physical labor never had been, because it never switched off and it never delivered the relief of an explanation. The belief that had taken hold among the workers was not a comfortable one. It was the quiet and serious conviction that people did not simply get lost in these forests by accident, that the disappearances which had marked this region's history over the years were not the result of misfortune or poor preparation, but of something that actively and deliberately took people. The logger described this belief without embarrassment or hesitation, because for him and the people he worked alongside, it was not a theory. It was the most reasonable explanation available given everything they had witnessed. He returned to the subject of Bigfoot not as a fantastical proposition, but as the closest available framework for understanding a creature that was clearly large, clearly intelligent, clearly capable of sustained and deliberate behavior, and clearly not interested in being identified on anyone else's terms. His account reinforced the physical evidence while adding a layer of behavioral analysis that made the whole picture considerably more disturbing. Then he turned to Bryce and Maria directly and told them, with the quiet seriousness of someone who has nothing left to prove and nothing to gain from the conversation, that the single most important thing they could do for their own safety was to stay as far away from those mountains as it was physically possible to get. They listened carefully, they thanked him for his time, and then they began planning exactly how to get up there. Into the predator's territory. Every serious investigator reaches a point where the evidence in front of them outweighs the warnings behind them, and for Bryce and Maria, that point had arrived clearly and without much internal debate. They had come to Prince of Wales Island following a trail of clues that had grown more compelling with every interview, every testimony, every detail that the masked logger and the frightened community had offered. And turning back at this stage would have meant abandoning the most significant field opportunity either of them had encountered in years of dedicated research. The warning had been heard, considered, and consciously set aside. The expedition they launched was not impulsive or underprepared. It was methodical and deliberately equipped for the specific challenges that remote Alaskan wilderness presents to an investigation of this kind. Drones were deployed to survey the canopy and map the terrain ahead of the ground team, allowing them to identify movement patterns and unusual disturbances from above before committing personnel to any particular zone. Scent detection technology was also brought into play, a tool that had proven valuable in previous investigations by identifying biological presences that visual and audio monitoring could not reliably confirm. The readings that came back were not what any member of the team had been hoping for, because hope, in a situation like this, is closely tied to finding nothing, and nothing was not what the equipment was detecting. Two distinct scent signatures emerged from the analysis, both of them deeply unpleasant, and both of them consistent with accounts that had appeared repeatedly across decades of Bigfoot-related field research conducted in various parts of North America. The first was the smell of rotting flesh, biological and heavy, the kind of odor that suggests either a kill site or a territorial marker deliberately placed to communicate something to anything approaching from below. The second was a wet animal smell of considerable intensity, not the ordinary scent of forest wildlife, but something denser and more persistent that clung to the air in a way that suggested a very large creature had been present in that zone recently. Two target areas were identified from the combined drone and scent data, and the team made the decision to divide, covering more ground and gathering parallel data sets that could be compared and cross-referenced later. Maria took the lower mountain zone with her part of the crew, working through terrain that was dense but navigable, while Russell led the second group to higher ground, where the readings had been strongest, and the drone footage had flagged the most unusual patterns of disturbance. Neither group knew yet what the night was about to hand them, but the forest was already answering in the only language it knew, and that language was about to become very difficult to misread. It all begins with a scream. The storm hit the upper mountain fast and hard, killing visibility and making every step forward a careful one, and Russell's team pushed through it slowly, picking their way across ground that shifted and slipped beneath their feet, while the trees above them bent and groaned under the weight of the wind. It was not the kind of storm that forces you to stop, but it was the kind that wears you down steadily, draining focus and making everything feel heavier and more difficult than it should. Then the smell hit them, and it hit them all at once. That same thick, rotting heaviness that the scent equipment had picked up during the earlier survey. But out here in the open air, it was raw and immediate, and far stronger than any reading had suggested. The kind of smell that reaches into something primitive and tells you without words that something has died nearby, and something else has been feeding on it. They slowed down without discussing it, moving more carefully now, listening harder. And that was when the rustling started, a steady pushing movement through the undergrowth somewhere ahead of them, too heavy and too purposeful to be the storm, too consistent to be a small animal, something large working its way through the forest with a weight that the team could feel as much as hear. What they found, when they broke through to the source, was not something any of them had a ready response to. Flesh had been pushed and wedged into the upper branches of several trees, not dropped there accidentally, not carried there by a bird, but placed deliberately at a height that required serious strength to reach, arranged in a way that suggested either storage or display or something else entirely that none of them could name cleanly. Then something moved at the very edge of their light, big and fast, visible for less than a second, before the dark swallowed it completely, leaving only the slow swinging of branches and the absolute certainty that whatever they had just glimpsed had been standing there watching them for a long time before it chose to move. The forest went completely still after that, The kind of still that does not feel like quiet, but feels like held breath. And every member of the team stood without moving, processing what they had just seen and understanding instinctively that the night was far from over. What Maria was finding on the lower mountain at that exact moment was about to add an entirely new layer to everything. The kill site. Maria's team had been moving through the lower mountain quietly, and the quiet had not been reassuring. It had been the kind of silence that keeps you looking over your shoulder, the kind that feels like it is being maintained rather than simply existing. And every member of the group had been feeling it steadily build for the better part of an hour before the clearing appeared ahead of them through the trees. They saw it gradually as they got closer, shapes on the ground that took a few steps to resolve into something recognizable. And when they did resolve, Maria stopped walking and stood completely still for a moment, because what was in front of her was a pile of bones, skulls included, gathered together in one spot in a way that had nothing natural about it. Animals do not collect, they consume and scatter. But this had been brought together deliberately, remains from multiple different animals gathered into a single location with a consistency that pointed to repeated visits over a long period of time. Maria had seen arrangements like this before in her years of research, similar piles documented in investigations across different parts of the country and across different decades. And the fact that she recognized it made her feel no better about standing in front of it, because recognition meant confirmation. And confirmation meant that whatever was operating in these mountains had been doing this for a very long time and was doing it with purpose. Then the equipment started reacting, readings climbing sharply, and suddenly in a way that indicated something large and close. The instruments jumping with an urgency that brought the whole team to attention before cutting out entirely, dropping to complete silence in a single moment that felt less like a technical fault and more like something switching off a light. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound, and that stillness was the most frightening thing that had happened all night, because it meant something nearby was choosing to be patient, and patience in a predator is never a comfort. Meanwhile, Russell's team was about to make a discovery on the upper mountain that would explain exactly why that patience was so deliberate. The creature outsmarts them. Russell's team went back to the spot where they had found the hanging flesh, needing to get a closer look and document everything properly. But what they discovered when they arrived stopped them cold and changed the entire shape of the investigation in a single moment. The flesh was completely gone, every last piece of it, taken cleanly from branches that sat a full 20 feet above the ground. And that detail alone shut down every ordinary explanation the team might have reached for. A bear cannot climb to that height and remove material that neatly. And even if it could, bears do not work cleanly. They tear and scatter and leave a mess behind them. But the branches above were undisturbed, and the ground below was bare, as though nothing had ever been there at all. The team worked through the evidence carefully, and the picture that formed was deeply uncomfortable, because the only explanation that actually fit what they were seeing was that the creature had climbed those trees, collected everything it had stored, and done all of this while Russell's group had been chasing the movement they spotted at the tree line just minutes earlier. That gap had been small, but it had been enough, and the creature had used every second of it. That was the moment the team understood they had been lured, that the brief sighting at the edge of their torchlight had not been accidental or careless. It had been deliberate, a calculated move designed to pull their attention one way while the creature moved freely in the other direction. It had watched them long enough to understand how they would react, and then it had used that knowledge against them with a precision that was almost impossible to sit with. This was not animal instinct. It was not random behavior driven by hunger or fear. It was clear and purposeful thinking from a creature that could plan ahead, set up a diversion, and execute it cleanly under pressure. And that realization settled over the team like something heavy and cold. They had come into those mountains believing they were the ones doing the hunting, and they were only now understanding, standing in that empty clearing in the dark, that the roles had never been what they assumed. What happened in a remote Alaskan ghost town many years earlier would soon reveal that this creature had been outsmarting people for a very long time. The truth behind the terror. Portlock. The expedition on Prince of Wales Island had shaken the team deeply, but as they pulled together everything they had gathered and began looking at the broader picture, something became clear that made the entire experience feel like one piece of a much larger and much older story. What had happened to them in those mountains had happened to other people before, in another part of Alaska, and those people had not been researchers with equipment and a team around them.
They had been ordinary families living quiet lives who had simply run out of options and walked away from everything they had ever built. Portlock is a small settlement on the southern coast of Alaska, and today it sits completely empty, a ghost town that was abandoned decades ago and has never been reclaimed. Its buildings slowly disappearing back into the landscape as though the forest is taking them apart, piece by piece. The story of why Portlock was abandoned is not clean or simple. It did not empty out because of economics or weather or any of the ordinary reasons that small remote communities sometimes fade away. It emptied out because the people who lived there became too frightened to stay. The trouble had been building for a long time before it reached its breaking point, going back as far as 1867, when Sugpiaq natives in the region described being attacked by creatures they called cannibal giants, large upright figures that moved through the wilderness with a speed and aggression that made any kind of defense feel pointless. And those early accounts had set a pattern that the following century would repeat again and again in slightly different forms but with the same terrible consistency. In 1931, a man named Andrew Camlock was found dead in circumstances that the community could not explain away comfortably. His skull had been crushed with a force that went beyond anything a simple accident could account for. And his dogs, working animals that knew that wilderness as well as any creature alive, had been torn apart in a way that left no reasonable suspect from the known local wildlife. A man named Tom Larson came face to face with something standing upright in the trees, covered in hair and enormous in size. And he later described being so completely overwhelmed by fear in that moment that his body simply stopped responding, frozen in place while the creature regarded him from the shadows before moving away. The disappearances continued after that, people going into the forest and not returning, bodies occasionally found in conditions that raised questions nobody wanted to answer out loud, and the community absorbed each event in silence until the silence itself became unsustainable. The locals had a name for it, Nantiinak, a word that carried generations of fear inside it. And what Bryce and Maria finally understood as they pieced the full history together was that their expedition had not stumbled into an encounter with an undiscovered animal. They had walked directly into an active hunting ground that something had been patrolling and defending for over a century, and they had been lucky enough to walk back out. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.